There are a million copies of this process running in our bodies. And that process actually started 4 billion years ago. What is this process? Let's dive in. Hey guys, welcome to the channel. My name is Reese. I used to teach tech ethics at MIT, but now I teach this series on how everything evolved, and it kind of synthesizes the research I've done over the past decade, including these 20,000 note cards that I've made on all these subjects. And so in our series on how everything evolved, we're going from the Big Bang through today, and right now we're chatting about the origin of life, which is around 4 billion years ago. And it's this amazing transition between going from atoms to actually going to life. Before talking about how the origin of life actually happened, I want to know, why do we care? I mean, it happened 4 billion years ago, so it's like, who cares, you know? And there are 3 big reasons. The first is it's fascinating. To go from an abiotic system to a biotic system is crazy. The second reason, it gives us a fluency with these origin processes. And so when we start to think about the origin of sapiens or the origin of AI or the origin of the Industrial Revolution, they all have similar processes at work. And so if we learn how they happen during the origin of life, we can then apply them later in our learnings. And then the third big reason is because it helps us understand kind of a gears understanding of biology and chemistry, biochemistry, so that we can start to build on that to understand life. Okay, so that's why we care. Okay, so today we're going to talk about 3 things. One is why the disequilibrium of the early Earth built these carbon chains. 2 is the specific carbon fixation pathways that resulted, the 2-carbon pathway and then this 3 to 6 carbon pathway. And then finally, we're going to look at how this Krebs cycle, how one of those pathways, the one that produced 3 to 6 carbons, if you run it in reverse, you actually take those longer carbon chains and turn them into energy. And we'll show how that process, which we call metabolism, how that exists in millions and millions of copies all around us every day today. So it started way back then, and it still is today. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is why the disequilibrium of early Earth, how that built these carbon chains. And the idea behind this is that no matter what you are in the world, if you want to be a pattern that continues to repeat over time, you need to have energy and information and matter. You know, for me, I have the information of my genes inside of me. I consume energy. I'm sitting on an energy gradient, you know, food and snacks and, you know, flaming hot Cheetos or whatever. And then I also have the matter where I'm getting the energy from my food, but it's also giving me the building blocks of carbon and proteins and fats to build my body. And so that's true for anything. If you're a car, you need to take in, you know, metals, and you need to take in energy in terms of gas to fuel yourself forward. If you're a little bit of life, like a bacteria or whatever, you also need that. And so you can kind of imagine the Earth as this big ball. Obviously, we're a massive ball with the sun pointing at us, and the sun points at everything, but also points at us. It's called the solar constant. And so it's a bunch of energy, a bunch of these photons that are hitting Earth. And because we're there, we get to exist in the flow of energy and everything else. And so there are 2 big flows of energy for Earth. The first that we're more aware of is photosynthesis. And so the sun is sitting in the middle of our solar system, and we're getting some of its photons. Plants are using those to do photosynthesis and to start to, you know, use energy and create life. And so that's one big form of this kind of sitting on an energy gradient. The other big form, though, at the beginning of life, you know, you can kind of imagine Earth as a battery. And it's this other weird form of gradient where you have essentially a bunch of H2, a bunch of hydrogen in the middle of Earth that's being slowly pumped out through the rocks. And then you have on the outside of Earth, you have it being kind of captured by CO2. And so it's kind of this big battery that's pulling electrons from the inside of Earth to the outside of Earth. And because of that, if you are a little creature that can sit on one of those boundaries, you can then use that H2 and the CO2 to start to create carbon chains for life. Okay? And so we can begin to look for these metabolic fossils, or these frozen processes that exist through time, that exist today, but also existed way, way back in the day. And I think the classic version of this is something like this metabolic map, where you can see here, this is this map of metabolism, and it has all these different reactions that take place. And in the middle there is the TCA cycle. That's the Krebs cycle. And so back in the day, it ran backwards in the reverse Krebs cycle, and these days it runs forwards. And so let's show that with our little snatoms. And so you can imagine back in the day, there were 2 main modes of carbon fixation. Remember that it was a reducing environment, which is really crazy. That means that, you know, instead of, you know, today we have a oxidizing environment. Because of photosynthesis, it's put all this excess oxygen into the world, and everything is based around oxygen as a way to suck electrons towards it. But back in the day, we had this reducing environment with a bunch of H2. And so one of the things that happens with a bunch of H2 is you have, CO2 that exists, and around these deep sea vents or whatever, the H2 gets to push itself onto the little CO2 and some other CO2. And what you get is you start to get these little 2-carbon chains. This is what's called the Wood-Lungdahl pathway, or I like to think of it as the acetate pathway. It produces lots of these 2-carbon chains, which are called acetate. And so you can imagine back in the day, we start to get lots and lots of these 2-carbon chains, a lot of this acetate. And this created essentially a feedstock where you have a bunch of these 2-carbon chains that then can be put into other things. And so these 2-carbon chains then went into the reverse Krebs cycle. They started to form a little 3-carbon chain, and then maybe you got a little 4-carbon chain, and then you got a 5-carbon chain, you have your little 6-carbon chain, and that thing breaks apart into a 2 and 4-carbon chain. And the cycle repeats again, where you go from, 2 to then 3 to then 4, etc. If you're in an environment, a reducing environment with all this extra H2, this process naturally occurs. This reverse Krebs cycle, or this reductive TCA cycle, it naturally starts to happen. And we start to get, when we started as a bunch of these 2-carbon chains, starts to become a world of 2-carbon, 3-carbon, 4-carbon, 5-carbon, and 6-carbon chains. We start to get this background condition where we're producing lots and lots of copies of these 2 through 6 carbon chains. And these 2 through 6 carbon chains are the building blocks of life. You can take them and turn them into proteins and turn them into sugars and fats and everything else, and DNA and RNA. And the crazy part about this is if you run this cycle, this way, clockwise, let's call it, that's when you have a bunch of H2, a reducing environment, this very naturally emerges where you start to produce, you take the energy that exists with all of the H2 around, and you turn that energy into biomass. You turn it into these longer carbon chains. But today, you have what's called an oxidizing environment where you have all of this oxygen around. And the oxygen, what it'll do, take the carbon, it'll rip it off these chains, turn this into something like CO2, shoot that off, as we're breathing CO2, turning oxygen to CO2, and then taking the hydrogen that was on this carbon chain, and it'll use that to then power the electron transport chain and to power the ATP synthase, which creates ATP and energy for our cells. This is to say that in an oxidizing world, this process runs the other way. So instead of taking energy and turning it and building carbon from it and building biomass from it, you're taking biomass, you're taking energy, you're taking glucose, and you're ripping the hydrogen off it and using that to create energy. And this process is happening everywhere. This is the process of what's called metabolism. And if you imagine a given cell in us, one little cell has, we have 10 trillion cells. Each cell has about 1,000 mitochondria in it, and those are the powerhouses of the cell. And each mitochondria of those 1,000 mitochondria has about 1,000 cycles of this Krebs cycle going at any given time. So as you can imagine, 1,000 lines, kind of like a factory of a bunch of these cycles running where each one's, pulling in some glucose, ripping the hydrogen off of it, and then turning that into ATP. And so that's happening of these 1,000 lines. You got 10,000 glucose being put in. So each one's running 10 times per second. Every second they're running, turning glucose into ATP for our cells. And so you can imagine one mitochondria, there's about 1 million cycles happening 10 times per second. So you have this massive frozen process that's occurring in our cells at every moment, which I think is really, really crazy. Life is humming with this frozen process that is happening one way now, and many, many years ago is happening in this opposite direction. Okay, I want to show a few videos that will help us understand this process a little bit better. So the first is just to look at the process of the citric acid cycle itself. It's really crazy. We can simplify and say, oh, it just takes carbon, glucose and turns it into energy. But when you're in the actual cell, it looks really, really crazy. So let's check out this first video.
The origin of energy production and biosynthesis inside your living cells is the dynamic mitochondria organelle. Mitochondria are filled with metabolic enzymes that catalyze a loop of chemical reactions called the citric acid cycle. The 8 steps of the citric acid cycle gradually break apart 2 carbon atoms from glycolysis, capturing liberated electrons for the electron transport chain, while generating carbon dioxide as waste. The citric acid cycle starts with...
So freaking cool. I mean, that image of this is just like amazing. All these crazy molecular machines that are going on all the time, and in any given mitochondria, 1,000 of these cycles happening at once, 10 per second, taking glucose and turning it into energy. Really cool, and also really complicated and hard for little brains to understand. So that's one video. The other video is an OG video. It's by Harold Morowitz, who is a great origin of life researcher. And this is kind of like a pre-YouTube video. I don't even know. Finding this was a hard thing. I didn't find it, obviously. O3 found it. I remembered it from the past, but O3 helped me find it. And so this is from 2007, from 20 years ago. And this is Harold Morowitz talking about how the cycle, the citric acid cycle, used to run one way and now runs the other way. So we're going to check out 2 separate little 1-minute clips from that.
The chart of intermediary metabolism. And the reason we're focusing on intermediary metabolism is that it is probably the most robust feature of all of biology. That is to say, if we look at the slide, you'll note that the atomic composition, the metabolic building blocks, and therefore the chart of intermediate metabolism, the cofactors, the core network, and the bilayer membranes have all been around for the 4 billion years or so that life has existed. So whereas the things we usually think of as being characteristic of life, such as the gene, the DNA sequence, the RNA sequence, the protein sequences, they have all changed, but it is very likely that the core chart of metabolism has not changed for 4 billion years. And that's extraordinary, and that leads us to believe that there must be some deep underlying principle behind the core of intermediary metabolism.
So good. So freaking good. He's saying, look, yes, we kind of think of DNA and RNA as being these core things, but actually if you look, they did exist in Luca. They exist slightly differently in bacteria versus archaea, etc. But those are core. But the other core thing is the metabolic fossil, is this process that's occurring. And so Harold's like, look, there's got to be something foundational with this. And that's true. It's this frozen process in time that just makes sense. It's like, oh yeah, you're starting to create these little hydrocarbon chains, and here's how you do them. You do them through this reverse Krebs cycle. So let's look at the second part of his talk here.
Metabolism. And again, let me stress that this intermediary metabolism seems to have been around for 4 billion years. And even when you change from reductive to an oxidative world, you just ran it in the opposite direction. But this core of the metabolism, I think of it as an informatic fossil which is older than the oldest rock we can get our hands on today by a couple of 100 million years. So that, and it has persisted, of course, because it's a replicating system, but it's more than a replicating system. It seems to have a property which you have to maintain so that by changes and mutations and so forth, you can't get rid of it. You have to stay with this basic, the basic chart of metabolism. To us, it is that fundamental.
Oh, amazing. Harold is saying, look, it's so fundamental that when we used to be in this world without oxygen, this reductive world. And even though when we switched worlds, when photosynthesis happened, when it killed 99% of species, the only thing it changed within metabolism is just flip the direction. It said, oh, instead of running this way where you take energy and turn it into carbon, now we're taking carbon and turning it into energy. But the same core structure of those 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons running that chain over and over and over again, that is running that cycle over and over again, that has stayed the same. Harold's amazing, and as a reminder, his book Nature and Origin of Life on Earth is one of my favorite books. It's by him and Eric Smith, The Polymath. It is 700 pages. It's a beast of a book, and it is amazing. So thanks for hanging out today. I hope this helps you understand how amazing the Krebs cycle is and how it's crucial at the beginning of life by taking energy and turning it into biomass and creating lots and lots of small carbon chains that then we could use to make bigger building blocks. And so next time, we're just going to keep on making bigger and bigger carbon chains. We're going to say, okay, now that we have, 6 carbons, how does that make longer carbon chains? And kind of start to build up from there until we eventually get a cell. Thank you, as always, for watching. And thank you to Roots donors for supporting this channel. If you want to understand more about the past and how we got here, check out the previous videos here. And if you want to understand the future and where we're going, feel free to subscribe here. Hope to see you then. Bye.